Bob Stern is the president of the Center for Governmental Studies in West LA and has been a fixture in discussions of electoral reform around California for as long as anybody can remember, and that's meant as a compliment. Bob was the principal co-author of the 1974 Political Reform Act, a major, major reform in the state, and was the first general counsel for the California Fair Political Practices Commission. He's going to talk a bit on how the Constitutional Convention process might address the initiative process, and also touching on a little bit of the history of constitutional conventions in California. Bob, 10 minutes. Welcome, and thank you.
Thank you. So the first thing I have for you is a question.
Give him a mic.
Well, the mic should be going on now. Is the mic on now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. First thing is I'm going to do a survey. I'd like to ask this question to you. And the question is going to be this, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. What do you have more confidence in, the legislative process or the initiative process? What do you have more confidence in, okay? First part, who has more confidence in the legislative process? Okay. And how many have more confidence in the initiative process? Okay, so it's legislative process. Well, you don't represent California.
Many have no confidence in any.
When polls are taken in California, 2/3 of Californians say they have more confidence in the initiative process than they do in the legislative process. So that's the first thing you need to remember. The second thing you need to think about is this, and I'm not going to ask for your answers, but just think about this. Think of an initiative that has passed in the last 50 years in California where the voters said we made a terrible mistake. We shouldn't have passed that initiative, and we would repeal it. Now, some of you are going to say Prop 13, but again, the polls show 2/3 of Californians would vote for Prop 13 again. Some of you will say Proposition, the gay rights, the gay marriage, and that one's very interesting because in 2000, 61% of Californians voted to ban gay marriage. Last year, only 52% did, but it was 52%. Probably in 4 years, that will be one that you can point as an example where they will reverse themselves. But there are very few initiatives where Californians have said we've made a terrible mistake and we should reverse ourselves. So when you're thinking about the initiative process, think about this. Californians have more faith in the initiative process than the legislative process, and there are very few initiatives where Californians believe they made a terrible mistake. Now, we have written a book called Democracy by Initiative. This is the summary, and we have about 100 copies in the back. You can pick up a copy. This is the big book. We don't have copies of that because it's too hard to pick up, but you can go online at cgs.org and download this if you're interested. And in the book, we are suggesting that there are 3 themes that should be addressed when dealing with the initiative process. First of all, we believe that voters want fewer initiatives on the ballot. Secondly, they want better drafted initiatives. And thirdly, they want more information about the initiatives. So let's talk about each of those. We would suggest the following: requiring any initiative that qualifies for the ballot to go to the legislature first to see if the legislature will pass that initiative and work with the proponents. We think that probably between 15 and 20% of the time, the legislature and the proponents could work out something and take the initiative off the ballot. We would say that the proponent would have to agree on any amendments, so the legislature couldn't do something that the proponents didn't want. But we think that could work. We've seen it happen occasionally. In fact, there's a classic case just in a couple of years ago where the legislature and the proponents did work out a compromise. The proponents said we won't turn in our signatures, but they turned in too many and went on the ballot anyway. And so you had probably the first time in California history where if you look at the ballot pamphlet, you'll see the proponents of the initiative saying, please vote against this initiative because we've worked out something with the legislature. It's the first time that's happened. It was Prop 91 in February 2008. Despite that, 40% of Californians still voted yes on the initiative. It did fail. But so we would say instead of going on the ballot like that because they had turned in too many signatures, we would say, let the proponents of the legislature work something out. It will be taken off the ballot. You will see fewer initiatives. Not an overwhelming number, but fewer initiatives. Secondly, we would say, if the proponent and the legislature couldn't work out a deal, we would want a better drafted initiative. Having been through drafting initiatives, I know that nobody can write a perfect initiative. Not even I can write a perfect initiative. And so as you're circulating it, as you're working with the legislature, you will find out problems with your initiative. But under the current system, you can't change a single word of that initiative. Once you've turned it into the Attorney General, once you've started collecting signatures, that's it. Every word is locked in. So we would say, having been through this process, that the proponent could amend their initiative provided it furthers the purposes and intent. The Attorney General approves that. A court doesn't say, no, it doesn't. So you would have a better drafted initiative on the ballot if it gets to the ballot. And then finally, we would say the voters need more information. We recommend that the Secretary of State include a page in the ballot pamphlet on one side, on the left-hand side, listing all the supporters, on the right-hand side, listing the opponents, because most of us are looking to see who's supporting, who's opposing the initiative. And if we can see groups and individuals in the ballot pamphlet supporting and opposing, that will help us a lot. Secondly, if there are two initiatives or two measures covering the same subject, we want the Attorney General to tell us that these two, by the way, could conflict with each other, and put that in the ballot pamphlet so that you know that only one can go into effect. If two measures pass, the one getting the most votes goes into effect. And secondly, we want to put them together so that you can see right after, one after another, these two conflict. And then we would say also the Secretary of State needs to modernize the way it presents information to us. We should be able to ask for the ballot pamphlet, for example, electronically instead of having it printed and sent to us. If it wouldn't be required, but if people did that, it would save $1 a copy and cut down the cost of sending out the ballot pamphlet. And we would also say the Secretary of State should be using more video, more internet information to us. So these are the things that we think would do a lot to improve the initiative process. We think that the proponents, by the way, would have incentives to work with the legislature in passing their initiative. When I was testifying before the legislature a few weeks ago on a bill dealing with this process, the big question was, well, why would the proponents want to work with the legislature and take their measure off the ballot? And I said, well, there are two reasons. Number one, only 31% of initiatives pass right now. In this decade, only 31% of initiatives were enacted by the voters, 69% saying no. So if the legislature will pass something that's acceptable to the proponents, of course the proponents would say, great, we would take that. And then secondly, of course, initiatives cost a lot of money. And it's at least $5 to $10 million to promote an initiative. So that's another incentive to the proponent. There's not as much probably incentive for the legislature to pass it, and that's always a concern. But the legislature, I think, in many cases will want to pass it. Let me just spend a few minutes on the whole process of the Constitutional Convention, because this is something, obviously, that you may be voting on next November 2010. There may be two measures on the ballot, one saying that the people have the authority to call for a Constitutional Convention, and then secondly, actually setting up the Constitutional Convention. And my colleague Molly Milligan is over here, and I have written an article for the State Bar, the Lawyers Magazine, which will be coming out in a few weeks. And we talk about the pros and cons of a Constitutional Convention. And let me just talk a little bit about that. It's critical that all of us start thinking about the structure of state government and how to begin to restore confidence in our state government and officials. No secret, confidence is extremely low. The legislature, I think it's at 13% we have confidence in the legislature, 34% we have confidence in the governor. And I'm not sure, frankly, what will come out of a Constitutional Convention, but I think the idea of having the discussion makes a lot of sense. You'll be voting on it probably in November 2010. The convention probably will occur in 2011, and then what comes out of that convention will probably go on the ballot in 2012. Will the voters approve what comes out of it? We don't know. But having that discussion, having that the voters consider, and having a group of citizens consider the structure of California government, I think will be very valuable for the state. We need some founding mothers and founding fathers to come up with new ideas on how to make our government more efficient, less costly, more responsive to the public, and more nimble to solve our state's problems. The last Constitutional Convention we had in California was 1879. That's the last one. No women were delegates to that convention, and they came up with some pretty bad things. And so you never can predict what's going to happen. But other states have it. Hawaii and Florida have constitutional conventions, and they do change things and make them better. Now, here are some of the things I think should be considered by the convention. We should be looking at the two-thirds vote. We should be looking at restructuring cities, counties, and other political divisions. We should be looking at term limits. We should be considering a unicameral legislature. We should be considering creating a 2-year budget cycle. We should perhaps be looking at mandatory sunset provisions for all governmental programs and agencies. We should be looking at reducing the number of statewide elected officials. And maybe we should be looking at a part-time legislature. So there's lots to discuss, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's viewpoint tonight. Thanks so much.